Good evening, everyone. So nice to have you all here. I'm Brigitte Weinsteiger. I'm the H. Carton Rogers III Vice Provost and Director of the Penn Libraries. It's really my privilege to be able to welcome you here tonight. Thank you for joining us for the first of the 2025 A.S.W. Rosenbach Lectures. As many of you know, the Rosenbach Lectures are the longest running lecture series on the subject of bibliography in the United States, and it is always our honor to be hosting them. This year's lectures, Indigenous Ecologies of the Page, Bibliography, Birchbark, and Remediation, will be delivered by the Rosenbach Fellow Kelly Wisecup. Kelly is the Arthur E. Anderson Teaching and Research Professor and a Professor of English at Northwestern University. Professor Weisskup's lectures will examine how Indigenous peoples made and used the page to address structures of dispossession. We're delighted to have Professor Wisecup here. You're going to hear more about her work shortly. I also did want to let you know that she'll be giving an informal seminar with collection materials on Wednesday from 10 a.m. to noon. I don't know which location though, here in the Lee Library, great. But first I want to recognize the Rosenbach Lectures Advisory Committee, which consists of scholars, faculty, and staff from across Penn and the larger bibliographic community. The committee is chaired by my lovely Penn Libraries colleague, Lynn Farrington, and its current members include Peter Diamond, Jesse Erickson, Devin Patel, Sean Quimby, Megan Robb, Joshua Teplitsky, and Whitney Tretian. So thanks to each of you for your dedication to this distinguished annual lecture series. Looking ahead to next year, I'm pleased to announce that our 2026 lectures will be given by Joan Judge, Professor of History in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies at York University in Toronto. Professor Judge is a cultural historian of modern China with a scholarly focus on knowledge cultures, print culture, and women's history at the turn of the 20th century. But right now I'm going to turn our focus back to 2025 and the lectures that are planned for this week. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Nancy Bentley, who is the Donald T. Regan Professor of English here at Penn. Professor Bentley received her PhD from Harvard University, where she specialized in 19th and 20th century American literature and culture. Her other research interests include law and literature, theory of the novel, African American studies, social theory, and cinema and media. She is the author of the books Frantic Panoramas, American Literature and Mass Culture, 1870 to 1920, and The Ethnography of Manners. She is currently writing a book called New World Kinship and American Literature, a study of the way the novel has mediated the multiple forms of kinship coexisting in the Americas. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bentley.
It's great to see everyone. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Kelly Wisecup. Kelly Wisecup is the Arthur E. Anderson Teaching and Research Professor at Northwestern University. She is a member of the English department there, as well as an affiliated faculty member in the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, and the Program in American Studies, and the Science in Human Culture program. Professor Wisecup has published several books, many important articles, and that includes her first monograph, Medical Encounters, Knowledge and Identity in Early American Literatures, which appeared in 2013. She followed that in 2014 with a scholarly edition of Good News from New England by Edward Winslow, which was published in the series Native Americans in the Northeast. And in 2022, Professor Wisecup co-edited with Lisa Brooks a beautiful new volume in the Library of America titled Plymouth Colony, Narratives of English Settlement and Native Resistance from the Mayflower to King Philip's War. I recently tried to buy a volume, to buy that particular volume at the Library of America, but they are all sold out. So I can attest that it's a hot commodity. I'm going to be looking at the secondary. Do you know if it's coming out with a new? Yes. Okay. I'm looking for a copy for you book people. Professor Weisskup's most recent book is Assembled for Use, Indigenous Compilation and the Archives of Early Native American Literatures, published in 2021 by Yale University Press. And scholars have called this study astonishing and path-breaking, among other superlatives, and I have to say that I agree. Assembled for Use gives us a rich portrait of what Kelly Wisecup calls Indigenous compilations, along with a fascinating story of what those assembled texts were able to do. In examples stretching from the 1750s to the 1890s, Professor Wisecup examines artifacts such as Samson Occam's medicinal recipes, Charlotte Johnson's poetry scrapbooks, Joseph Laurent's compilation of Abenaki grammar and word lists, and the financial account books that Simon Pokagon incorporated into his widely read text, Red Man's Rebuke. Much of the physical materials for these compilations were documentary forms, like catalogs and printed paper blanks, forms that were instrumental, of course, to the efforts by settlers to standardize information for colonial boundaries and meaning making. But Assembled for Use shows us how Indigenous people use creative techniques of proximity and juxtaposition in order to make new boundary-defying meanings out of some of the selfsame colonial materials. The book makes a bracing claim, I think also a persuasive claim, that as these shared acts of textual use, these compilations can redefine the category of Indigenous literature itself. The book won the 2023 Early American Literature Book Prize and the 2023 St. Louis Mercantile Library Prize, awarded by the Bibliographic Society of America. So I'm sure that you, like me, are very eager and pleased that Professor Wisecup is here to share her series of lectures on Indigenous Ecologies of the Page, Bibliography, Birchbark, and Remediation. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Wisecup.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Nancy. I really appreciate it. And I want to say special thanks to Lynn Farrington and John Pollock for helping with logistics and all of my questions, as well as to Eddie Mizukani for helping with flight logistics and hotel logistics. I want to give a thanks to Megan Heffernan, who's my Chicago area colleague, for reading a very early version of tonight's talk when it was at a much longer and much messier stage. I also want to acknowledge that we are on Lenape homelands here at Penn, and that Northwestern, my institution, is on the homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, and also the homelands of the Miami, the Menominee, and the Ho-Chunk. I'm sharing new work with you all tonight and really all week. And so I'm excited to think with you about the materials I brought together here in the spirit of thinking through this new project and this new work. I want to start, if I can advance, there we go. I want to start in November 2024 on the floor of the New Zealand Parliament, when Maori MP Hannah Rahiti Maipi-Clark stood up and tore in half several pieces of paper. On the papers was printed the text of a bill that proposed to change the terms of Maori-New Zealand relations. After tearing the papers, Maipi-Clark began to sing a haka. So this is a song used in important occasions. And this haka had been composed in the 1820s by a Maori leader to celebrate resistance and survival against difficult odds. Other Maori members of parliament joined in the haka, and they were eventually suspended from the House. Clips of Maipi-Clark's speech, the tearing of the pages, and the haka went viral, part of a huge protest against the bill that had begun even before Maipi-Clark's protest in Parliament. The principles of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill that Maipi-Clark and others are protesting would redefine how the nation's founding document, the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi between Maori leaders and the British Crown, is interpreted. The bill essentially argues that all people in Aotearoa or New Zealand should be treated, quote unquote, equally, in ways that undercut the treaty's recognition of Maori sovereignty and the obligations of the nation state to Maori peoples. So the reference to equality here acts as a kind of veil for anti-sovereignty principles. In one of the few interviews she gave about her protest on a podcast called The Morning Shift, Maipi-Clark said that the lead up to her viral moment had been extremely tense, noting that she and others had been working for almost a year to oppose the bill, but that the decision to tear up the papers had been last minute. She said the Maori members of parliament decided, quote, "We should just rip it. The bill means nothing." And she insisted the treaty unites us. So I imagine book history is probably not the first association for people reading news of Mike P. Clark's protest. But I'm also fairly certain that I'm not the only person in this room to think of D.F. McKenzie's 1986 book, Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts. The fourth chapter in McKenzie's book focuses on the 1840 Treaty of Waitangi. The treaty is one of the case studies for his argument that book historians should examine, as he put it, the social realities which the medium of print had to serve. This chapter, The Sociology of a Text, Oral Culture, Literacy, and Print in Early New Zealand, was initially delivered as a lecture to the Bibliographical Society in London in 1983, published in the library in December 1984, and then published as a book by Victoria University Press in 1985, before then being included in Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts. So a quick summary, just because so that everybody's on the same page, and just recognizing that the audience has folks from different disciplinary backgrounds in it. In that chapter, McKenzie is interested in how the importation to Aotearoa of English language literacy and its communication technologies, which included a printing press and type, a Latin orthography for the Maori language, and instruction in devotional reading practices. McKenzie details missionary efforts to, quote, reenact one of the most momentous transitions in human history, the reduction of speech to its record in alphabetic form. Yet, as McKenzie shows, the missionaries overestimated the reading literacy Maori people actually possessed in order to bolster the case for their own efficacy. This overestimation factored in hugely significant ways into interpretations of the Treaty of Waitangi, which has multiple textual variants in English and Maori, and each of the pages here represents one of multiple variants. These variants define Maori sovereignty and the legal status of Maori homelands differently. The question of which text is the most complete one, which version has the most authority, are, McKenzie suggests, matters of textual criticism, of textual variants, and of the different cultural understandings of literacy, print, and territory that informed the treaty and its signing. Tonight I want to make two claims to orient tonight's talk and to set in place the topics I'll discuss this week. One, that McKenzie made Indigenous literatures a key example of the sociology of texts. In that fourth chapter, he writes about oral speeches and diplomatic protocols, written texts translated into Indigenous languages, and treaties shaped by negotiations. Even as McKenzie's scholarship has become a mainstay of book history, however, Indigenous books, bibliographies, and scholars have remained in the background of bibliography and book history as fields. So tonight, I recontextualize McKenzie's chapter on the Treaty of Waitangi. I read the chapter alongside contemporaneous bibliographical and book historical scholarship the scholars were conducting with Indigenous manuscripts, periodicals, and printed books at roughly the same time McKenzie was working. In returning to moments of deferred or disavowed relationships between Indigenous studies and book history, I'm interested in finding avenues for future engagement between book history and bibliography writ large and Indigenous book history. And in thinking about these futures of bibliography and book history, I'm following on last year's Rosenbach lecture by Elizabeth McHenry, who was the co-winner of the St. Louis Mercantile Prize with me. And so work on Black bibliography by people like McHenry, Jacqueline Goldsby, Meredith McGill, and many others, as well as work in Latinx bibliography by Kirsten Silver-Gruz, feminist bibliography and queer bibliography by Kate Osment, Heidi Craig, Kaden Henningsen, and of course, many others. These are scholarly models from which I've learned a lot in writing these lectures and in doing my work, and on which I hope to build this week. In the course of researching and writing and giving these lectures, one hope is that I can develop an argument about how Indigenous book history might contribute to these more recent reassessments of the histories, methods, and futures of the field of book history. I'm going to lay out these connections across the lectures because I want to ground them in particular analyses. So I'm flagging here that I see a lot of opportunities for shared work among Indigenous book history and other scholarly conversations, and I'll return to them in more detail across the week and especially on Thursday. The second claim I want to make this week follows Mike P. Clark by turning to the page as the primary object of focus. Her actions and her comments highlight the political ecology of the page as a signifier of state power and of Maori sovereignty. So this takes me in a different direction from the last 30 or so years of scholarship on Indigenous books and writing. While it's not acknowledged, that scholarship also has a link to McKenzie. In its attention to how Maori people experience literacy, Mackenzie's chapter foreshadowed the power that narratives of orality and literacy had in late 20th and early 21st century on scholarship on Indigenous books. His rationale for focusing on the Treaty of Waitangi is that the 2 decades leading up to the signing offer a compressed repetition of, in Mackenzie's words, the movement from orality through manuscript literacy to the introduction of printing. Indigenous studies scholars have significantly revised Mackenzie's assumptions about the binaries of flexible orality and stable print, not to mention his sidelining of Indigenous media forms. So in the Maori context, these would include, for example, marae carvings, patterned tapa or bark cloth, and tattoos. But questions about the relations between print and writing and the effects of European assumptions about writing and orality on Indigenous peoples continue to orient much scholarship on Indigenous book history. And to be sure, these are questions of importance to Indigenous nations and book history scholars alike. And we can think about how in Western courts, the status of oral stories has been subject to judges' assumptions about orality and its validity as a container for memory and its reliability as legal evidence. This week, I want to argue that Indigenous writers use the page to negotiate relations among oral, embodied, and graphic communication systems, and to comment on the political ecologies of the page, particularly its connections to conceptions of property. So in tonight's lecture, I'm going to sketch out relationships among the page, property forms, and bibliographical scholarship to set the stage for slightly more focused talks on Tuesday, when I'll examine Indigenous histories of the page as a material form by focusing on Birchbark pages and books. And then on Thursday, when I look at the role that Indigenous ecologies of the page have played in narratives of woodpulp papermaking. So to start, Indigenous literatures, books, and book history. There are a lot of places to start this history. As promised, I want to begin with work happening roughly contemporaneously with Mackenzie's oral culture, literacy, and print in early New Zealand. This is not a claim for origins, but rather an attempt to kind of think about what is happening at the same time Mackenzie is working on the Treaty of Waitangi. So I'm going to start in 1970, in March at Princeton University, with the first convocation of American Indian scholars. This was a gathering of Indigenous writers, artists, historians, and educators. The organizers observed that Indigenous peoples were often the objects of government, popular, and scholarly attention, but were not part of decision-making that affected their lives. And so a goal for the convocation, as this collection of talks put it, was to bring Indian scholars together to take the lead in formulating clear-cut stands and goals on the issues. Presentations were given by the novelist Inscott Momaday, historian and theologian Vine Deloria Jr., the artist Fritz Scholder, anthropologist and educator B. Medicine, and others. The next several decades, across the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, saw a host of bibliographies of Indigenous books and periodicals published as part of those efforts begun at the convocation to cohere disciplinary fields and curricula. There are too many for me to discuss, so I'm going to highlight just a few. Levon Brown Ruoff's American Indian Literatures, an Introduction, Bibliographic Review, and Selected Bibliography, published by the MLA in 1990, contains a bibliography of existing bibliographies and of Indigenous literatures. The American Indian Historical Society, this was one of the organizations that helped convene the 1970 convocation, printed several bibliographies of Native American literatures through its publications arm, the Indian Historian Press. These included Jeanette Henry Costco's 1975 Index to Literature on the American Indian. Cherokee scholar Daniel F. Littlefield Jr. and his collaborator James Perrins produced several bibliographies of Indigenous periodicals that are still indispensable. In 1984, American Indian and Alaska Native newspapers and periodicals, and in 1985, a biobibliography of Native American writers, 1772 to 1924. And while they aren't bibliographies per se, there are also a number of anthologies of Indigenous literatures that are sort of doing bibliographic work at this time. They're focused both on what were then often called myths, we would probably call them traditional stories or oral stories now, and on contemporary poetry and fiction, and they're often edited by Indigenous writers. So these include Laguna Pueblo Paula Gunn Allen, Mohawk writer Beth Brandt, Acoma Pueblo poet Simon Ortiz, and the Oneida writer Roberta Hill. There are also guides for teachers like the one on the right here called Books Without Bias that assess the accuracy of available curriculum and provide alternative materials for teachers. So the convocation and then the bibliographies that followed launched new scholarship on Indigenous literatures and books. And I see two moves toward defining Indigenous writing in these works. First, in 1981, Simon Ortiz articulated what he called a national Indian literature, constituted by the continued telling of oral traditions in the language of colonizers, Spanish, English, French, and so on. Ortiz argued that Indigenous literatures in those languages realize oral traditions in print. And so here he's pushing against perspectives that see such literatures in translation as somehow less authentic versions of those oral stories or poems. And then second, in 1994, Walter Mignolo and Elizabeth Hill Boone sought to redefine definitions of writing in their edited collection, Writing Without Words, Alternative Literacies in Mesoamerica and the Andes. Focusing on pre-colonial and 15th and 16th century texts, the chapters examine Indigenous systems of inscription, from hieroglyphs to pictographs to maps, as forms of literacy worthy of the same study as alphabetic writing. Hill Boone's introduction critiques existing ideologies of writing and of the book. She argues that studies of alphabetic writing as the most highly evolved form of written language are premised on what she called an unconscious bias toward Western European culture. This bias, she argues, led scholars to overlook Indigenous graphic systems, including pictographic and glottographic systems, which range from representing speech to representing ideas. Hill Boone instead offers what she calls an inclusive definition of writing, as the communication of relatively specific ideas in a conventional manner by means of permanent visible marks. Osage scholar Robert Warrior's books Tribal Secrets in 1997 and The People in the Word, Reading Native Nonfiction in 2006 expanded on Ortiz's scholarship by studying a long history of North American Indigenous literatures in English from the 18th century to the 1970s. Alongside the focus on Indigenous novels and poetry that rose to prominence at mid-century as part of the so-called Native American Renaissance, Warrior placed nonfiction at the center of Indigenous literary histories. This focus on nonfiction and the relationship his books established between early, quote unquote, and contemporary Indigenous writers set the agenda for the next several decades of research on Indigenous periodicals, autobiographies, political pamphlets, and more. Moving into the 2000s, studies of Indigenous books and writing systems analyzed both alternative literacies, pictographs, quipu, syllabaries, and more, and Indigenous writing in European languages. Scholarship on pre-20th century Indigenous writing in English addressed dynamics among writing, print, and orality, between print and the book as colonial technologies, and Indigenous peoples' creative adaptation of Western technologies of writing for personal and political ends. I'm going to move through this genealogy of the early 2000s and then into the kind of mid-2010s quickly and selectively by first looking at how scholars addressed relationships among non-alphabetic communication systems and writing, and alphabetic writing, and then looking at how scholars have approached Indigenous adaptations of literacy and print. So I want to emphasize this is not a comprehensive bibliography. I'm trying to orient us as opposed to be complete. So I'm very mindful of all the things that are left out of what's about to come. Ojibwe writer Louise Erdrich's 2003 Books and Islands in Ojibwe Country is a book of essays describing Erdrich's travels to an island in Rainy Lake. And this is a lake up north on Ojibwe lands across which the US-Canadian border has been drawn. Erdrich muses on Ojibwe literary and linguistic traditions, including the islands in Rainy Lake that her Ojibwe ancestors used as surfaces for painting pictographs and that she calls libraries. She writes of the relationship among writing systems, saying, Ojibwe people were great writers from way back and synthesized the oral and written tradition by keeping mnemonic scrolls of inscribed birchbark, the first paper, the first books. For Erdrich, as for the makers of these scrolls, the oral and the written are not functioning as oppositional modes or categories, but instead the scrolls are an essential part of a system that, as she puts it, synthesized the oral and written traditions. Cherokee scholar Christopher Tutin's Deep Waters, the Textual Continuum in American Indian Literature in 2010, developed this argument with a focus on what Tutin called graphic, oral, and critical impulses. These impulses are interdependent, he argues, and his attention to impulses, rather than more static terms like cultures, lets him trace, for instance, the ways that literary texts like novels might engage with graphic forms like a wampum belt or sand painting. Similarly, other scholars have offered nuanced ways to see the relations among orality, alphabetic literacy, and non-alphabetic graphic forms. They show both that Indigenous peoples possessed many forms of graphic communication that they complemented with oral embodied practices. So one example of this would be the protocols for reading wampum belts. The graphic designs of the belt are connected to scripts for embodied performances that are used when the belts are read publicly. There's a spate of scholarship about Indigenous writing and print cultures in the Northeast. And this made clear how vast the archive of Indigenous writing in English before the 19th century is. In particular, Wiss's books focus on Indigenous writing in context of missionary education, when alphabetic literacy was particularly fraught as a technology of assimilation, dispossession, and punishment. The overconfidence of missionaries reporting passive converts, Wiss shows, belie an archive of Indigenous resistance, self-expression, and sovereignty. Published in 2010, Phil Round's removable type offers a history of Indigenous print between 1663 and 1880. Like Wiss, Round acknowledged that European uses of print as a colonial technology, even as he focused on Native peoples' self-conscious application and adaptation of Anglo-American ideologies of print, the many competing notions of print literacy that were merging in their societies, and the interpenetration of oral, manuscript, and printed forms of publication. We also see a growing number of studies working in Indigenous language archives. So not assuming that there's a link between literacy and a non-Indigenous language, but in this case, using Hawaiian language skills to unpack archives in Indigenous languages that are full of periodicals, geography textbooks, and more. This scholarship has also been followed by attention to Indigenous print cultures from book historical and archival institutions. So the American Antiquarian Society's 2013 summer program in the history of the book was on Indigenous cultures of print in early America. This was followed by 3 rare book school courses on Indigenous books in 2018, 2021, and 2024. And another one is on the books for summer 2025. I'll also say that the AAS's summer seminar and the first rare book school course were really influential to my own scholarly development and the shape of my own work. So they've really, I think, impacted and shaped the field in ways that are still unfolding. I also want to acknowledge that, as I said before, there are many books that I have left off of this very quick genealogy. So I've put a working bibliography of Indigenous literary studies and book histories on Google Docs. And so you can check it out there at the bit.ly that's on the screen. So tonight, I want to build on all of this scholarship while returning us to the page. In its focus on writing systems, literacies, and literary genres, Indigenous book history has largely passed by the page. I think one useful gauge for this observation is an oft-cited moment from the Franciscan missionary Christian Leclerc's 1691 New Relation of Gaspésia. So this is an account of Leclerc's travels in Micmac territory in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in what's today Nova Scotia. He describes his process of deciding to use birchbark sheets as surfaces for inscribing hieroglyphs that he claimed were based on Micmac writing in order to, as he put it, teach the Indians to pray to God. He hit on this idea of inscribing hieroglyphs on birchbark when he observed Micmac children making marks with charcoal on birchbark and counting these with the finger very accurately at each word of prayers which they pronounced. Leclerc returned to the same place several years later and found that his system of making letters on birchbark had spread among Indigenous communities. So this scene appears in numerous scholarly studies that approach the scene from different disciplinary perspectives. It's cited as an example of writing systems and their transformations in colonial encounters, of exchanges of language philosophies, of translations of the Bible, and of Indigenous literacy and literatures. The birchbark sheets are cited by literary scholars like Annette Kolodny and Lisa Brooks as an instance of early Indigenous literary genres whose transformations they then trace into English language genres. And Brooks in particular traces them into genres like letters, petitions, journals, and communal narratives. So I want to build on this scholarship, but I also want to ask tonight what happens when we let the marks or letters inscribed on birchbark sheets stay a bit blurry and focus instead on the page as a container for texts, images, and blank space. This week, I want to follow not transformations of orality into literacy or messages on birchbark into other genres, but sustained uses of birchbark substrates as surfaces for inscription. What looks at times like a story about Indigenous peoples learning alphabetic writing, or like an adaptation of birchbark pages to letterpress technologies when we focus on letters inscribed or impressed on a page, instead appears as a complex history of Indigenous peoples using the space of the page for a range of purposes, and of settler papermakers who saw Indigenous peoples as essential to the stories of paper they wanted to tell. My focus on the page this week opens up a history of Indigenous peoples' experiments with birchbark page and bookmaking at the end of the 19th century, the continuation of those experiments in contemporary Indigenous poetry and art, and the entanglement of those experiments in settler nostalgia and the business of deforestation. So that's a little preview of what's to come for the rest of the week. For the rest of this talk tonight, I want to give a short history of the political ecologies of the page in Indigenous books and periodicals between 1828 and the 2020s. I'll focus on Indigenous peoples within what's currently the United States, because that's where my expertise lies. And I'll argue that examining the history of Indigenous uses of the page can illuminate how Indigenous peoples experimented with representing the relationship between orality and writing, and all of the political stakes attached to that relationship with the page. I argue tonight that the process that Mackenzie and many other scholars have described as linear, the process of moving from orality to literacy to print in the sped-up Gutenberg revolution that Mackenzie discusses in Aotearoa, is in Indigenous literatures a material, political, and ontological question that Indigenous writers, editors, and bookmakers actively engage and manipulate. So in what follows, I'll lay out 4 ways that Indigenous peoples use the page to engage this question, with an example for each. So first, Indigenous writers, printers, and editors used blank space to represent differences between English and Indigenous languages and orthographies. Newspapers in English and an Indigenous language highlighted their bilingual nature by leaving blank spaces on the page. Early issues of the Cherokee Phoenix are a good example of this. First published in 1828 and still in circulation, the Phoenix is edited and printed by Cherokee people in the Cherokee. When the paper began circulation, it was bilingual. It featured columns in both English and the Cherokee syllabary, and the syllabary had been invented about a decade earlier by a Cherokee man named Sequoyah. Because the Cherokee language text in the syllabary took up less space than the English language text in the Latin alphabet, the editor Elias Boudinot and printer Isaac H. Harris had extra space in the Cherokee language columns. The editors left parts of columns blank, thus highlighting visually the differences in Cherokee and English orthographies. The blank spaces, and I'm trying to advance to my next slide here, which has another example. Thank you. Thank you. The blank spaces draw attention to the differences between the languages as spoken and as they appeared in print, raising a host of questions. These questions are not so much about the movement of orality to writing, but about the differences between writing systems, a syllabary versus an alphabet, and about the decisions typesetters and editors made when arranging type in different languages. This use of blank space to represent linguistic incommensurability also appears in the dedication pages to the Sauk leader Black Hawk's autobiography. So I'm going to pause here and just make sure I can advance slides. There we go. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we also see blank space in the Sauk leader Black Hawk's autobiography. This is published after his defense of Sauk lands against settlement and his imprisonment by the United States. The Sauk language dedication, which you can see on the left here, is longer than the English translation, leaving readers who are not bilingual to wonder about the differences in content. And in fact, when the linguist Gordon Whitaker translated the Sauk text in 2015, he learned that the Sauk language dedication is not the same text as the English language one. You can see his essay, The Words of Black Hawk, and Phil Round's 2024 book, Inscribing Sovereignties, also talks in detail about this dedication. These blank spaces highlight differences in content, as well as differences between languages and orthographies. The page visually represents the incommensurability of language systems and the different reading publics the text served, most of whom were fluent only in one of the printed languages. Okay. So 2, Indigenous peoples used the page to reassemble printed texts in ways that transformed reading practices. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Seneca man Ely S. Parker, well, what's that? Oh, you're right, thank you. Okay, so these are the Ely S. Parker scrapbooks, and he is a Seneca man who in the late 19th century and early 20th filled 12 commercially produced scrapbooks with newspaper articles about Indigenous peoples. He sometimes uses the margins to annotate and correct inaccuracies, especially regarding his own work as the first Indigenous Commissioner of Indian Affairs. I've been thinking about these scrapbooks for about 15 years, along with Angela Calcaterra, and we're finally co-writing an article about them. I think one thing that makes the scrapbook so challenging as text is that there's many possible interpretations of the arrangements of the news articles. I'm happy to talk about those more in the Q&A, but I think one interpretation is that changing the relationship of text to page space changed how one read. In other words, the scrapbooks changed the experience of seriality. They sometimes speed up time by allowing readers to move quickly through news articles about an event, or they slow time down by spreading an article that originally took up one folio page in a newspaper across multiple scrapbook pages. So here's just one example. Parker clipped a January 18, 1891 Chicago Inter-Ocean article about the Hotchkiss gun that in the newspaper took up 4 columns on the front page. He cut it into pieces and pasted it over 4 pages in the scrapbook, and you see just the first 2 pages of the scrapbook on the left here. He placed the story in the scrapbook immediately after articles reporting on the December 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, which the Inter-Ocean article only glancingly acknowledges as context, even though this is a gun that's involved in the massacre, and this is, of course, the whole rationale for readers' interest in it and for a very long article about the gun. So if overall the 12 scrapbook volumes compress the experience of reading daily newspapers across decades, speeding up reading experiences, the Hotchkiss article, cut and pasted over several pages, departs from this method by making readers slow down and consider the gun more carefully. The multiple pages on which the article appeared and the surrounding articles about the massacre in the scrapbook insist on a consideration of the gun's consequences for Indigenous peoples. 3. Indigenous editors use the page to create sites of exchange among other Indigenous peoples. So here we can turn to the Yavapai Apache physician Carlos Montezuma and his newsletter Wasaja, which is self-published in Chicago between 1916 and 1922. Montezuma included a correspondence section that made the page a site of transnational exchange among Indigenous peoples from different tribal nations. Montezuma used Wasaja to argue for the abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This was at the time not a mainstream opinion among Indigenous intellectuals, but one that Montezuma held on the basis that the Bureau existed basically to perpetuate itself rather than to better the lives of Indigenous people. And Montezuma himself was part of intertribal conversations among Indigenous leaders, writers, and activists about the possible futures for Indigenous people in a world shaped by several decades of forced linguistic, cultural, and vocational assimilation in boarding schools, brutal violence, including massacres like Wounded Knee, that imposed US military might, and a reservation system that restricted Indigenous peoples' movements. Montezuma reflects this conversation on the page by assembling letters from Indigenous peoples across North America. In contrast to the Society of American Indians periodical, the American Indian Magazine, which printed content written by its letters or that reported on the SAI's meetings, Montezuma printed letters from readers of Wasaja. Some of these letters support his own position on the Bureau's abolition, but they also cover a range of topics of interest to Indigenous peoples across North America. As Rochelle Ranieri-Zuck has shown in her work on Wasaja, the correspondence sections create and visually represent conversations across Indigenous nations. Finally, and I'll spend the most time in this last point, Indigenous writers made the page into a physical space of negotiation among print and speech, and they linked this negotiation of media to conflicting conceptions of sovereignty. The Pequot writer and activist William Apess staged conversations between statements made in both speech and print by using footnotes to create supplements to the body of a text or to amend an official text. In his 1835 book, Indian Nullification of the Unconstitutional Laws of Massachusetts relative to the Mashpee tribe, or the Pretended Riot Explained, Apess recounted the Mashpee's case against the state, and also against overseers who were appointed to manage Mashpee lands. Those overseers used Mashpee funds to hire a white minister who was unwanted by the tribe and ineffectual, and they used their power to sell or rent lands for their own enrichment. They also sold timber from Mashpee lands, some of the only remaining forests in a region where most of the trees had been cut for ship construction and fuel. When Apis and several Mashpee men confronted local settlers named the Sampsons, who were stealing wood, they accused Apis of inciting a riot, leading to his imprisonment for 30 days. Indian Nullification is an assembled book. Apis juxtaposed proclamations written collectively by Mashpee people with extracts from newspapers, legal documents, and his own observations of events and the debate in the Massachusetts legislature about the nature of Mashpee sovereignty. Apis recognized the page as a space where Native people were often misrepresented, where speech and actions could be twisted into meanings that would carry weight in the world, often to ends harmful to Indigenous people's safety and well-being. I'm going to lay out a few examples of this before discussing them. After protecting their wood from the Sampsons, the Mashpee met with an envoy bearing a letter from the Massachusetts governor. The letter indicated that the governor anticipated violence and was ready to call out the posse comitatus, in his words, and be present personally to direct any military requisitions. Apis wrote in the body of the text that the letter indicated the governor, quote, had been led by wrong reports to believe that violence and murder were likely. An asterisk sends the readers to the footer, where he printed part of the governor's letter. A few pages later, Apis recounted the Sampsons' claim that he threatened, quote, to cut up a shine with them if they continued taking wood. Another asterisk directs readers to Apis's observation in a footnote. I do not recollect uttering this expression, and it is not one I am in the habit of using. Apis also printed the unwanted minister Phineas Fish's proposal to, quote, explain to the Indians the laws as they then stood and the consequences of violating them. He told us that merely declaring a law to be oppressive could not abrogate it, and that it would become us as good citizens whom the government was disposed to treat well, to wait for the session of the legislature and then apply for relief. A footnote here observes, it was either insult or wrong to call the Mashpee citizens, for such they never were, from the Declaration of Independence up to the session of the legislature in 1834. Finally, Apis used footnotes to comment on acts of the Massachusetts legislature related to the Mashpee. These footnotes demonstrate Apis's characteristically scathing sarcasm. This is an evidence of the paternal care of the legislature, for which we can never be too grateful. So Apis uses footnotes to contest official interpretations of events, to question misleading testimony about his actions, and to supplement references to legislative acts with direct quotations from those acts. The footnotes make the page into a space for negotiating among competing written documents and oral accounts, that is, among speech, print, and memory. Apis's work in the footnotes bears out Amy Gore's argument that paratexts, in her words, embody a front line of colonization in which Indigenous authors battle the public perception and reception of Indigenous books and negotiate the representations of Indigenous bodies. I'd add to Gore's insight that Apis used paratexts, specifically footnotes, to make visible the power dynamics between speech and print, between written documents authored by individuals of different social standings. So this is all, as scholarship by Ann Blair and Anthony Grafton, among others, has shown, pretty much within the expected uses for footnotes. But Apis then does something unusual. He links the relationship between text body and footnote to questions of sovereignty. Contestations over the reliability of various statements in Apis's text are political contestations over the nature of sovereignty for Mashpee, Massachusetts, and the United States. Key here is Apis's footnote observing that the Mashpee people are not citizens. This note references restrictions on US citizenship in the 1830s, and it also refuses the incorporation of Mashpee peoples into the US nation state. The footnote visually marks that political separation and difference. We might draw here on Marcy Dinius's argument about what she calls the textual effects of David Walker's 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Dinius argues that Walker carefully crafted his polemical and didactic text rhetorically and visually, to produce a sense of how the text sounded and to model different forms of reading. Likewise, Apis created textual effects through his manipulation of the page, its blank spaces, and the hierarchies of text and footnotes. The footnotes visually record the assumptions on which state claims to Mashpee monies and lands stood. These textual effects register political hierarchies and the contested state of sovereignty when, as Mohawk political theorist Audra Simpson has put it, political entities are nested That is, when a sovereign body like Mashpee is physically located within the state of Massachusetts and within the United States. The footnotes register how documents, acts, laws, letters, and newspaper articles work to limit Mashpee sovereignty or to disregard it altogether. And crucially, the footnotes show that the state and settler nation are not stable or natural entities, but exist in relationship to other sovereignties, even if the relationship is one in which, to refer to Simpson again, one sovereignty proliferates at the cost of the other. So APUS's footnotes stage the ways that Mashpee lands and people remain separate from the state of Massachusetts. Mashpee people are not citizens, and their lands are not reducible to resources like trees that can be sold. His footnotes also anticipate 21st century Native Studies scholarship seeking to pry apart the terms land and property. As Seneca scholar Mashana Goman put it in 2015, a consequence of colonialism has met a translation or too easy collapsing of land to property, a move that perpetuates the logics of containment. Political theorist Rob Nichols analyzes the process by which this collapse takes place in his 2020 book, Theft is Property. He describes the work of settler colonialism as that of transforming indigenous lands into an abstracted entity that could be defined as property, something that could be bought, sold, traded, and circulated. Nichols seeks to resolve a crucial dilemma in analyzing this transformation. In order to describe the theft of indigenous lands, one must invoke a system that understands land as something that can be owned and thus stolen, even though property is precisely the form that displaces indigenous forms of belonging to lands. Describing dispossession, in other words, requires one to already rely on a system of property relations that doesn't accurately reflect and in fact obfuscates indigenous people's obligation-based land rights. This means, in Nichols' words, that settler colonialism transforms non-proprietary relations into proprietary ones, while transferring the control and title of that property. It then figures the dispossessed as original owners, but only retroactively, that is, refracted backward through the process itself. As Nichols observes, in and through this process, land came to be understood as something that could be not only individuated in measured, discrete units, but also abstracted and registered in legal codes that could be circulated, traded, and pledged. Nichols makes a passing reference to paper in this process, citing historian John Weaver's comment that property was, quote, condensed into paper assets. And while Nichols' focus isn't on the paper part of paper assets, paper is nonetheless critical to transforming lands into property and to retroactively figuring the dispossessed as original owners. Paper, and the space of the page that paper provided, works as a material and bureaucratic technology to transform land into an abstract entity. To examine these relations between page, paper, and property forms, I want to conclude by reading two poetry collections published in the 21st century. The Dene and Métis writer Matthew James Weigle's 2022 book, White Mud Walking, and the Lakota poet Layli Long Soldier's 2017 book, Whereas. Both collections foreground the page as a surface for writing and as a material space for wrestling with conflicting understandings of indigenous lands. Weigle's book narrates his research in the archives of Treaty 6 at the University of Alberta. The book traces how the lands on which the University of Alberta sits and through which White Mud Creek runs were ceded in Treaty 6, mapped onto square plots, and transformed into the city called Edmonton. So if you can see White Mud Park on the top left, the creek runs to the bottom of the slide, kind of from that text on the slide. The book also enacts a counter-argument or a counter-movement in which Weagle locates himself in relation to White Mud Creek and the urban forests surrounding it. He describes those places, not the university from which he received his degrees, as his primary source of learning. The dual focus on archives and lands is mirrored in Weigle's descriptions of the treaty as a material text. He's attentive to its call number, its ink, its spine, the deteriorating condition of the paper on which the treaty is printed, and in his insistence on the treaty as a document that glosses obligations to place. Long Soldier's poetry collection, Whereas, takes up the question of the state's obligations to Indigenous peoples and its failure to reckon substantively with those obligations. Her collection is probably best known for part 2 of the book, which is also entitled Whereas. And this section rereads an apology to Native peoples that President Obama signed in 2009. That apology is then added to a 2010 Defense Appropriations Act, but Obama never delivered it directly to Indigenous peoples. So across the book, Long Soldier reflects on the genre of the apology, when an apology counts as such and when it doesn't, what apologies can accomplish, and what it means to place an apology in a defense appropriations bill. Across the entire collection, Long Soldier grapples with how the page is used as a technology of dispossession. So this is the third section in the book's first long poem, and that long poem is titled Hey Shapa. Long Soldier there creates a space in the middle of the page by arranging the poem's 4 lines at right angles from each other. The lines read, "This is how you see me, the space in which to place me. The space in me you see is this place. To see this space, see how you place me and you. This is how to place you in the space in which to see." This poem creates a new space on the page. Its shape gestures to histories of enclosing Indigenous lands, whether by making reservation boundaries or by surveying land to allot it into smaller plots. It is the space in which to see, a line we might, drawing on Nichols and Goman, read as referring to the ways that imposing property forms onto Indigenous lands made new ways of seeing those lands as individual plots that could be abstracted from Indigenous relations and responsibilities, further divided, circulated, traded, and sold. This third section also follows 2 others that reflect on the impossibility of translating Lakota language words into English. Black Hills, the English translation of Hey Shapa, doesn't adequately reflect the rich and complex meanings of the Lakota words. The box making a space in which to place me on the page also frames the page as a material space that narrows meaning, a space that represents as blank, as empty, without meaning, open for possession, that which has a host of meanings in another language. As Sarah Dowling has pointed out in her reading of the poem, the white space of the page here is at once blank and filled with meaning. The box and the blank space within it reflect how property is not simply an enclosure of open lands, but the imposition of forms for defining and understanding a place on top of pre-existing forms. The imposition of these lines casts those pre-existing forms as blank space or absence. Long Soldier's poem gestures to a lengthy history of the blank as an empty space on maps and documents, as well as of the blank as a literary figure for describing Indigenous histories. I'm just going to give you 2 examples, but I'm happy to talk more about these connections in the Q&A if you'd like. So this is a map that represents US boundary lines drawn across blank space from Lake Michigan and going west. This is a space, however, that in previously produced maps had been very carefully drawn and annotated to indicate the location of Indigenous nations and their homelands. So what we see here is a creation of blank space, not a lack of knowledge about those lands. And then on the bottom, the Schoolcraft quotation is separate from the map, but it's super interesting to me because of the way he's using the blank as a kind of trope for figuring absent or empty or meaningless Indigenous histories. So again, happy to come back to this. I want to go back to Long Soldier's poems here to go on. In the first of the whereas poems, so those are the ones that are reflecting on Obama's apology, Long Soldier directly links the blank spaces in the poem to the page. She writes, "Pages are cavernous places, white at entrance, black in absorption. Echo. If I'm transformed by language, I am often crouched in footnote or blazing in title. Where in the body do I begin?" Reckoning with Native people's status as paratext, whether in apologies placed in addendums to bills or in footnotes to dominant histories, Long Soldier narrates the page as an echo chamber of whiteness. We might understand the cavernous page that's both blank and absorbent alongside Long Soldier's commentary on linguistic and racial categories in her second whereas poem. There, she reflects on an Oxford Dictionary's warning. Do not use Indian or Red Indian to talk about American Native peoples, as these terms are now outdated. Use American Indian instead. Long Soldier points to the emptiness of all these terms, observing how American Indian emptiness surfaces not just on the page, but often on drives, in conversations, or when I lie down to sleep. This is an emptiness that consumes. Like Columbus's misnamed discovery, pages and their surfaces absorb Indigenous peoples into racial categories, into the emptiness of all pervasive whiteness. We might see Long Soldier's representation of the page as both cavernous and empty, as adding to the dynamic that Jonathan Senshin has analyzed in 19th century print culture, wherein the desirable whiteness of the page was, as he puts it, inextricable from the processes by which Blackness becomes difference and whiteness the unmarked center. So I think we can add to that black-white binary that scholars of African-American print culture track the ways that for Long Soldier, the blank white page consumes and renders empty Indigenous nationhood, languages, and lands. So I've just shown you or argued that Long Soldier and Weigel use the material space of the page to show how property forms transform relations, language, and belonging into something that can be described as empty or blank. And yet each poet also uses the page to rewrite relations among peoples and lands. Each poet uses the page to reclaim land, in Mashana Goman's terms, as a storied site of human interaction that provides meaning well beyond jurisdictional legal values. So let me walk through this by talking about Weigel first. Okay, so Weigel begins section 2 of his book with a discussion of paratext. He writes, when academics speak about books, they sometimes use words like paratext to talk about the material that surrounds the text. What follows is a paratext of Treaty 6. I use Commissioner and Lieutenant Governor Alexander Morris's 1880 book describing the Crown's view of the treaty negotiations as a way for you to hold that paratext. The margins of that book invite you to the gutter of this one. Behind this, through the middle and out the spine, is the treaty. Weigel then creates new paratexts for the treaty. He prints half of the treaty on half of each page, leaving huge gutters. Meanwhile, the treaty bleeds over to and off the edges of the page, and Coach House Books prints the foredge to represent the treaty seeping off of the pages. Weigel creates blank spaces to locate the treaty off the page, outside the book, in the set of obligations Métis and Dene people have with their homelands, rather than in its abstracted property forms captured in the text of the treaty. He redefines the relations between paper and treaty, writing, "You would be forgiven for thinking that the large sheets of paper with ink on them are the actual treaty itself. In truth, the agreement exists as an embodiment of ceremony and lived movement within the framework of laws that extend throughout this treaty called Treaty 6. The spirit and intent of this has been acknowledged by both the Crown and the Crown in Canada. The text is not the treaty." Weigel's paratexts urge readers to move off the page and to consider the relationships, the land, the creeks, the life, off the pages of the treaty and the book. But this also isn't a total abandonment of the page for water, mud, trees, and air, although these features do appear significantly in the section of the book that follow. Instead, Weigel uses the creation of blank space on the page to try to locate readers in relation to the treaty, both the written text and the embodied obligations that can't be contained on the page. He asked readers to linger in the gutter of his book. His use of paratext as white space, suggestive perhaps of the emptying of land, of peoples and their memories of the land, as well as of a pathway outside of the book, indicates how, as Beth McCoy has argued in the context of narratives written by formerly enslaved peoples, working with paratext is to encounter the structures of white domination. Like the Black writers and editors McCoy reads, Weigel demonstrates how using the page to recover relations with lands is to encounter all the ways that settler colonialism relies on paper and the page to make property relations real. Weigel makes the page and its paratext into a contested space, reflecting treaty obligations and the Crown's failures regarding those obligations. What might first appear as empty paratexts, a looming gutter, an absence, or an elegy to loss, is instead a space that holds obligation, relationships, reciprocity, all acknowledged in the treaty but insufficiently enacted. If Weigel creates white space to send readers outside the book, Long Soldier renders pages as violently empty blank spaces and simultaneously as the spaces where she does her work. The blank spaces in her poems are the space in which to place me, restrictive containers that diminish meaning. They are also the space in me you see, that is, spaces that aren't reducible to blanks. These layered meanings of the page are evident in a poem in which she relies on book historical language as a trope for dispossession. She describes trying to clean a pigeon nest off of a porch while riffing on the meaning of pigeonhole, both a gross pigeon nest and, in its bibliographical sense, as white space on a page. She writes, whereas a pigeonhole is AKA a white hole, the dictionary says. A white hole is known as the white space between words, set too far apart in letterpress printing. A term synonymous with pigeonhole, we don't want it, ever to say we suffer the assignment of a stagnant place in the system. She goes on, I definitely don't want it either, the stigma of a place I shy, away from what's admitting to her in my work, this location. where I must be firmly positioned to receive an apology, the spot from which to answer. Standing here, I regard an index finger popping up, pointing out a reminder. As with Weigell's paratext, the white space in Long Soldier's poems is not only a figure for emptiness or absorption or loss. The white space between words, the pigeonholes, are also the site of her work and the place of grappling with settler guilt, what she calls the stained refusal to come clean. In 3 poems later in the collection, Long Soldier transforms blank space into sites where she has, as she puts it, safetied away words. She uses black brackets, her term, to cordon or safety away the words in Obama's apology, and that's the second image that you see there. What you see across these poems is the use of brackets to create white space for keeping certain words safe. These poems remake blank spaces on the page into places where Long Soldier can safety words away from enclosure, mistranslation, and settler forms of recognition. The white spaces are not just sites of emptiness, but also sites thick with meaning, with the suppressed but present Lakota words and the relations to Lakota they hold. The page becomes a space for withholding, and the white spaces materially represent that withholding. So I'm going to conclude here. Today I've argued that the relations among orality and literacy and print that have occupied bibliographers like McKinsey and scholars of Indigenous book history alike become in the hands of Indigenous writers, editors, readers, and printers not only a set of ideologies or a way of mapping books onto historical timelines, but a question that's material, political, and ontological. Indigenous editors, printers, and writers use the material space of the page and its combination of text and blank space to mark out the quandaries of nested sovereignty and to demonstrate how property forms distort Indigenous relations to land. These writers also transform pages and their tropes by remaking the meaning of white space. Gutters, margins, pigeonholes become not just blank space, but sites thick with meaning, if one knows how to look, or thick with meaning secreted away so one can't see them. So I want to end with 3 questions that I'll return to across the week that today's brief history of the page raises for me. So first, how might bibliography and book history attend to the page as a material form that's entangled with property forms? How have Indigenous writers, editors, and bookmakers used the page to highlight the stakes of those property forms and to safety away other forms of relation? Finally, one of the arguments I'll make across Tuesday and Thursday's lectures is that attention to the page foregrounds questions of territoriality over temporal questions, Gutenberg revolutions, transitions from orality to literacy, teleologies of literacy in the book. So with that shift in mind, how might we reconsider not just the relationships between bibliography and Indigenous book history, but also what's involved in a sociology of the text? What other social realities and relationships come into play when we attend to books in relation to place? I'll take up this question of the place of book history by thinking about histories of Birchbark pages and books tomorrow, and then woodpulp paper making and Birchbark remediations on Thursday. Thanks very much.
Thank you so very much for the wonderful talk. When you put together the techniques, let's call it techniques, of the use of the footnotes as questioning, the white spaces, the scrapbooks, and so on and so forth, these are not invented by these writers.
Yes, yeah.
I wonder what would happen if one would contextualize it. Where do they have it from? I certainly work on texts with footnotes like these, have nothing to do with Native Americans.
Yep, absolutely.
Certainly there is a tradition of modernist poetry that uses white spaces and so on. So I wonder what it would be if one would also use the idea of translating and subversively transforming for political means, and where do they collect it from? So,
thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I love your thinking about translating and transforming. So I think I'll start by saying, one thing I'm kind of interested in here is the ways that Indigenous writers, editors, printers are in fact working with received forms, right? As you point out, a footnote is not a thing that Indigenous people are inventing, just as they're working in English language, right, which is a language that they are learning often in missionary or kind of forced educational systems. Yeah.
I meant precisely the move of the subversive footnote.
Yeah. Well, so partly what I want to say is that I think their use of footnotes to think about property and to frame questions of sovereignty is in fact a subversive move. So the thing I want to think about is the ways they are taking this technology that certainly they're not inventing, that many other people have in fact used subversively in their own context, right? But that the thing that is subversive or transformative is the ways they're using it to think about property and sovereignty. And so that I see as a kind of precise, unique thing that all of these writers are dealing with. Does that get at what you're asking? Okay, yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Anybody here? John.
Thank you, Kelly, for a beautiful opening lecture and raising a whole bunch of questions that I'm looking forward to hearing you work on all week. Maybe I can just return to your starting point of Mackenzie. That's such an important essay for all of us in the field. And I admit ignorantly, I don't know much about the 2024 protests. And I guess as a way of asking a question, I know that Mackenzie was involved himself through his writing, but also through his public work as a scholar and as an activist in Maori rights movements. I'm curious, not necessarily if he's evoked in the recent controversies, or if he is, that would be interesting to know. But I guess how you, looking back now, would evaluate his presence in those movements, resistance to his formulation. I mean, many of us teach that essay, and it would be interesting to know. You're suggesting the gaps in it. I'd like to hear more about Maori points of view about it. Any thoughts on that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I do not know, although I assume there exist Maori perspectives on Mackenzie's work. I think there is a collection, yeah. I think his work is hugely important for Maori literary studies and is seen as such by literary scholars working in it. So there isn't a sense, I think there's a shared sense of his importance to that field, just as there is here, right? And, my trying to think about him is to sort of question some of the assumptions he makes about print and orality, which I think the field is in a different place, but has built on his work. But also to say, he's somebody who was thinking about Maori texts at a time when not many people in book history were. And so can we think about that as not an origin, but an important moment in the field that we might return to as a way to think about Indigenous book history and its relationship with the field writ large, if we sort of go back to that moment and consider it. So I think that already came across, so I'm a little bit repeating myself, but I'll just say, I think Mackenzie is also, based on his public work and other writing he did that shows how attentive he was to the ways the treaty was when he was writing, being renegotiated and through various commissions, really attentive to its power in Aotearoa at that moment. So he's not somebody who's thinking about the 1840s as merely a moment that's passed, right? I think that's impossible. So I don't know that I have a great answer to the question, except to say I think collectively to return to that moment and think about where it might lead us if we put those Maori texts at the center is a question I'm interested in thinking about across the week. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. This may be something you'll get to later, but thinking about the materiality of the page itself, its relationship to paper, its relationship to wood pulp, is that like an alienated form for the poets you're looking at? Whereas birchbark is obviously a more localizable form. And I'm thinking as a medievalist where Birchbark is used in places like Novgorod in the Middle Ages. But of course, medieval manuscript, you're got a relationship to the animal itself. The page that you suggested there was almost like an evacuated, neutralized space upon which they're incising.
Yes. So I'm going to answer this across the week, but I'll try to just give a little bit of a preview here. So one thing is that I think Long Soldier and Weigel are not super interested in what composes the page. So they're not interested in woodpulp. They're interested in the page as a kind of political ecology, as a blank space on which they make marks. And Weigel in particular is interested in the kind of material text of the treaty. So he talks about it oxidizing and its the border of the page, but again, not so much in its substrate, right? So, and I don't say that as critique, I just say that to say this is sort of what those poets are interested in. The folks I'll take up tomorrow are people who at the end of the 19th century make books out of birchbark at a moment when their lands are being deforested. And so they are very interested in using this is an image from one of the books I'll talk about tomorrow, using birchbark as a thing that evokes trees and a whole other host of associations, which I'll talk about tomorrow, for Indigenous and non-Indigenous readers alike. And then probably the newest work for these talks is going to be on Thursday when I talk about how wood pulp paper makers at a moment when in the early 20th century, they start to realize that clear cutting forests is going to have effects on their business, start to try to think about trees in paper. And so even if it is a more alienated form than birchbark, to be sure, there are all kinds of rhetorical moves that folks start to make at that moment to like de-alienate the form. And birchbark is very important to that in ways I'll talk about on Thursday. So I think it's absolutely in conversation with something like parchment, even if I think the genealogy is a little bit different because of the ways that Indigenous peoples are involved via deforestation and the kind of history of birchbark bookmaking that I'll tell. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. I really appreciate it. As someone from outside the field, I loved your the clarity of your genealogy of the field that you gave us at the outset. On the question number one up there, I had a question that emerged through this talk, but hopefully is not anticipating too much the next ones. I was struck by the poets and also the text with the footnotes. You know, the way they engage with the page as a material form that's entangled with property forms or with sovereignty is very much dependent on the codex form. Mm-hmm. So the gutter, the fact of a gutter margin, even the safetying away was like transporting to the facing page. I think you had it there.
Yep.
And yet in the European and U.S. context, the primary site of like property mm-hmm. pages are separate, right? Are separate by deeds and other things like that, which might be bound up and of course codified into codexes. But I'm just wondering, if you can say anything about the difference between the space of a page and like the opening or the recto inverso or things that are only sort of working in the codex form.
Yeah.
Even the foredge.
Yes, absolutely. Form, so. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think one of the things that Apis, Weigel, and Long Soldier, and probably Apis more than these folks are interested in, I think, or have serious stakes in, is the book as a form, right? And so for Apis, this involves copyright. This involves thinking about how the book is laid out. He has a lot of control over that publication process. And I think Weigel's book with the foredge printing suggests the same, right? So I think that there is a kind of dual consideration here of the ways that the page as blank space and what it kind of affords and evokes in terms of property forms is a kind of useful space for subversion or translation on the part of Indigenous writers, but that there is a kind of another level that I didn't quite get to in the talk that is around the codex form and that is around the kind of cultural power of that form, certainly in the 19th century for Apis. And I think for Weigel, I think he's, and this is my reading, I have not talked to him, so it's speculation, but there's a sense that he's kind of interested in material forms of books generally as but also in archival forms. And so I think it's a dual kind of interest for him. So I say all this to say, I think that they are seeing this sort of, or they're kind of working between, as you point out, the ways that something like scrip, right? So like the ways that indigenous land was sold and then quickly devalued and sold to other people would be a single sheet of paper, right? The ways that a blank can appear in a book, but on a page, and usually on something like a receipt, right? Not a book. But that they're using the cultural power of the codex and the thing that it affords for them as a writer in their work against those sort of the kind of property forms of the blank. So I think the codex then in that sense offers a kind of another level of claiming cultural authority in this argument about sovereignty, if that helps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I wonder if you could tease out a bit more the connection or the progression between the newspaper with the blank white spaces as an indigenous form and the scrapbooks that are filling up the pages as much as possible, often with pieces that have been cut out of the newspapers. So how do we go from the one to the other, and what can that tell us about different indigenous practices?
That's really great, thank you. So I would say a couple things. One, we could just historicize it and say the Cherokee Phoenix is produced in a different place and in a different moment in newspaper publishing than when Eli Parker is working at the end of the 19th and 20th century, which is to say the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper is extremely time and financially onerous to produce. And so Budnot actually writes a note in the paper saying, we're sorry it's taken us so long to get this next issue out. It takes a really long time to get Cherokee language materials and then for us to set them in the syllabary. And so I think what we partly see is that length of time in those blank spaces that it takes to produce the newspaper. And then I think by the time we get to Ely Parker, we have seen an explosion of newspapers as media and a real circulation both of local papers, but also of metropolitan dailies that we see reflected across the 12 scrapbooks in the proliferation of articles about single events. So for instance, just to take the Wounded Knee example, Parker pastes stories mostly from Chicago papers, but from a couple of different Chicago newspapers across the scrapbooks. And so he's kind of comparing and contrasting the different takes on what settlers think is happening at Wounded Knee. And you probably know there's a lot of kind of media frenzy before any violence actually takes place. And scholars have argued that that media frenzy actually contributes to the outbreak of violence and to the massacre in 1890. So I think we see something about speed, and we see something about indigenous peoples engaging periodical production from the perspective of people who are trying to produce it, but grappling with the kind of labor that it takes and the kind of financial infrastructure, and then somebody grappling with, as Parker is, how indigenous peoples are represented in print rather than the Cherokee Nation representing itself in print. And so for Parker, I think you just get this sense of a kind of overwhelming amount of text and information that he's very carefully tracking and annotating across the scrapbooks. So that's how I would talk about kind of different indigenous practices. Thanks.
Peter's going to do a couple of questions from the Zoom.
Of course, thank you. So a question from Zoom that comes from Hester Bloom. Thank you for the fantastic talk. Your opening example is marvelous, and I am struck by the performativity of tearing up the legislation. In your other readings, do you see a similar impulse to deform the written page rather than write back to it?
Yeah, thank you for coming, Hester, and thanks for the great question. This is a great question, and I'm trying to think. I don't know of anything off the top of my head where I have something similar to tearing up a piece of paper. So I think what I would argue then, as opposed to deforming, is that we see a defamiliarizing of the page. And so I'll talk about tomorrow the ways that I think Birchbark defamiliarizes the page and people's expectations for it. If I think of another instance of someone deforming or ripping up the page, I will email you and let you know. Thanks for the question.
Sure. This question from Zoom comes from Kai Pyle. When looking at the bibliography you've given us of scholarly work on Indigenous book history, I'm always struck by how often people invoke things like birchbark, scrolls, and pictographs, but it seems like scholars rarely engage with the actual contents of that rather than using it as a jumping off point. Though there are also questions of uninitiated people engaging with those sometimes sacred and restrictive forms, I'm wondering if this is something you've thought about and how you navigate this in your work with the materiality of birchbark.
Thank you, Kai, for that question. I think this is true. I think we see across scholarship a kind of citation of pictographs or hieroglyphs or quipus, but obviously these are different linguistic systems and different writing systems, and not everyone has the linguistic skills to read them. That's, I think, a very different case in Mexico and Latin America, where there are scholars who have deep linguistic skills and have learned to read things like quipu and other orthographic and pictographic systems. So, you know, one kind of gap in my bibliography is all of the work that scholars have done there. So I think that one of the things we see in Indigenous book history is a focus on Indigenous writing in European languages, right? In English, Spanish, French, and so on. And, you know, it's interesting because this is a thing that Ortiz is kind of defending in 1981 and saying, you know, there is a kind of, we need to consider these things Indigenous literatures. This is a moment when people are kind of interested in touching some kind of authenticity. But I wonder if one result of that is that there has been less attention paid to the other kinds of writing systems and the kind of deep language skills and textual skills that would be required to read those. So that's not to dismiss at all the work that's done on Indigenous books in other languages, but to say I think there is a gap there. And, you know, I think it is at the level of graduate study that we need to think about addressing that. And this is a tough moment for graduate study, as we all know. So I think one place that's doing this, and I think it's probably no mistake that Kai got their PhD from University of Minnesota and is asking these questions, but University of Minnesota's Native Studies program has language classes in Dakota and Ojibwe. And so, you know, that's not pictographs, so that's not exactly your question, Kai, but that is another kind of orientation to Indigenous literatures that I think is becoming necessary to do careful, good work in the field.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Kelly. This was amazing. Really, as someone who's spent too much time working with New England Algonquin deeds, I appreciate how provocative some of what you're saying is. My question for you is kind of related to one of the Zoom questions about deforming, but I phrased slightly differently about refusing the page, because it strikes me, you know, in the Maori example that you open with, you have an instance of an Indigenous person destroying paperwork in service of protecting another piece of paperwork, right? Which is the treaty. And it's, as you were going through some of this, I was trying to think in my head and go through examples of instances where Indigenous people refuse the page and refuse to deal with paperwork. And it's striking to me how rare that is. And actually, I could not come up with an example of that, which I think is quite interesting. So yeah, have you found that? And yeah, thank you for provoking the question to me, because I actually think it's extremely interesting how much even Indigenous people who are trying to subvert existing paperwork are often using other paperwork as recourse.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for your work on those deeds. They're tough to slog through, but it's really important. There's important things in there. So I think there are a couple of things about this, and thanks for re-asking this question, because it also made me think of the American Indian movement's March on Washington and their tearing up and destroying of archives at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I think actually, in response to Hester's question, I might say the BIA kind of destruction of archives. And there are also some great scenes in some Gerald Visner's novels that imagine the kind of destruction of paper. But, you know, I think there's a couple interesting ways to think about your question, one of which is that, you know, as a literary historian, so much of my work and my archives, not all of it, but much of it is on paper. And so I wonder if there's a little bit of a bias there in that I'm going to be looking at things that are on paper and people who engaged with paper, and the people who refused to, who said like, no, I see what this is doing and I'm not engaging with it. We do not have as many records of, right? I think Sequoyah, the inventor of the Cherokee syllabary, is an interesting example. You know, he rejects the English orthography that a minister had made for the Cherokee language, but he also kind of refused to put himself into writing, and he refused to kind of be legible to English-only speaking audiences in a way that I think makes him a very fleeting archival presence. So I guess I would say, I think we have to think about our archives and the ways that they are going to show us what's on paper. I also think, and happy to talk more about where these citations would be in treaty negotiation records, especially from the Great Lakes, which is what I know best. There are instances of people saying, your paper lies, and you use it in order to produce deceit and theft, and we see that, and we have other ways of communicating that we actually hold each other to a standard of honesty and transparency. So I would think about those moments as one where people said, you know, you bring in all these papers, but you just use them to produce and proliferate deception. And I see that as a kind of rejection of the page, perhaps. Thanks.
Hi, thanks again for such an interesting talk. And also thank you to Hester and Peter for lobbing some questions that are also related to the question that I had, which is about kind of the relationship between like performance and orality and text. I was really struck by especially how you opened and ended your talk with examples of like extra textual context, like the performance of destroying the treaty, as well as poetry, which is often an oral spoken medium. And it had me thinking about a poet, Ticonawage Emily Pauline Johnson, who famously performed in a Victorian dress and then also in a Mohawk outfit, poems about her identity as being an Indigenous person in the 19th century. And so I was just curious if you've encountered other examples of where performance or like the speaking of some of these texts has actually like brought new meaning or kind of further helps us like understand beyond just what's like written on the page.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is a crucial thing that I moved through kind of quickly, but I think wampum belts are a really critical example here, right? Where they are texts that are read, but it's not a kind of silent act. It's done publicly. There's a whole protocol for speaking and for reciting what's on the belt. And so I think that's a text that where performance is necessary to its interpretation and reading and understanding. I mean, I would think about Weigel too as somebody who tries to get us outside the book. And, you know, after section 2 of the book where he says, you know, out the spine of this book is the treaty, most of the rest of the book of poetry sort of takes place obviously on the page, but also on the land. And so I think he's interested in maybe not like performance in terms of like a public event, but embodied relationships to places that I think for him are glossed by, but not contained by the page. And I think, trying to think of other examples. I think maybe I'll just end with Weigel, you know, and I'll say one of the things that I love about that book is that he's often framing these moments of kind of embodiment as painful. So he talks about falling off his bike and skinning his knee and thinking about the land and the gravel embedded in his knee as part of his relationship to land. So I think we often, or scholars or I, sometimes sort of laud the performative as or I want to put it in a binary with print, but I really appreciate the way Weigel says it hurts sometimes to be embodied and to be on your land and to have it actually in your body. And so I think he's playing really interestingly with what that means and the relationship between his body and the land. Thanks.
I think our last 2 questions will come from Zoom.
Okay. The first of these 2 comes from D. Andrews. Thank you for a brilliant talk. Your concluding remarks on property remind me, that's D, of course, of the commodification of peoples in the slave trade and print sources like the famous Brooks slave ship. This may be beyond your intended focus, but do Indigenous texts also talk about the commodification of peoples as well as of places?
Yes, this is a complex question and I will try to do it justice. So first, I'll just say that one of the places I'm driving this week is to think about Indigenous thinking about property and the imposition of property forms onto land in relationship with the ways that folks are thinking about the transformation of people into property. And I think one thing that Indigenous studies analyses of property can hopefully add to that conversation is a sense of the ways that transforming things, transforming peoples and living lands into property is one of the things that colonialism does. So just to give a sense of that's where I think this kind of work around property can take us. And then I would say right now there is a robust conversation in Indigenous studies and Black studies, and I'm looking at you because you asked the question, Peter, but Dee, I'm also looking at you. There's a robust conversation in Indigenous studies and Black studies really thinking through this relationship between land and peoples. And so Katie Walkowitz is a scholar whose recent book on periodicals in Indian territory really carefully thinks through these relationships and thinking through both periodicals printed on Indigenous lands and sovereign Indigenous nations and in Black towns within what was about to become the state of Oklahoma. So I would start with Katie's book and look at their bibliography as a place to kind of start thinking through that long history of those relations and conflict and the kind of conversation in the fields right now.
And we'll close with a Zoom question from Ralph Bauer. Thank you for a great talk. As you know, in 2007, the UN General Assembly adopted the long-anticipated Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by a vote of 143-4. The 4 countries that voted in opposition to the declaration were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States, all of them former British colonies. So what is gained and what is lost by focusing Indigenous studies on the Anglophone post-colonial world generally, and especially with regard to questions of textuality?
Thank you, Ralph. Ralph was my dissertation director at the University of Maryland, so there's a lot embedded in that. Thank you. And Ralph's work, comparative work on British and Spanish empires is, of course, really influential to my own work and lots of work. So, I would say I think we gain an understanding of how settler colonialism as a feature of the British Empire, and then I think also a feature of US settler colonialism, was imported to other places. And there are, clear sort of models imported, especially from the US, to other places. So I think we get a sense of kind of comparative settler colonialisms, and we can think about how it moves and travels and replicates itself in different ways. And then I'm imagining that Ralph's question is also pointing us to think about other spaces like Latin America and South America, where there's a really different relationship between indigeneity and empire, between indigeneity and whiteness. And I think those contexts are hugely crucial for understanding sovereignty and indigeneity, especially because they are quite different from their US, Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian contexts. So you should read Ralph's book as one way to start there.
I'd like to thank Kelly for a wonderful evening, and we look forward to Tuesday, tomorrow night. So thank you so much.
Thanks.